Later that afternoon, after the tour of the castle had encompassed the student rooms and the grounds, Snape took her to a room in the teaching quarters which was to be hers for the time she was at Hogwarts. It was quite small, contained some basic furniture in it, a bed, desk and wardrobe. There was a door at the other end which Cecilia opened, and discovered it led to a bathroom. Her belongings, which Snape had packed and sent on, were already unpacked into the wardrobe adjacent to the desk, and her glassware, books and reagents were in an alcove near the bed. The smell of pine, as if the room had been freshly cleaned, pervaded the air. She looked around at the room, her home for the near future, and felt a pang of unease and insecurity in the unfamiliar surroundings. "Teachers tend to conjure their own personal possessions," said Snape, as she looked around the room. "However, should there be anything you need, please don't hesitate to ask." Cecilia had looked around and wondered how asking for her teddy bear here would go down. To say Snape had not been the friendliest of people up till then was an understatement, and since their meeting with Dumbledore that afternoon he had become colder still. Not well, she concluded. There took in the rest of the teachers' block. He pointed out his own room and that of the other professors, who were themselves on summer break. Just then, the head of Professor Binns had popped out of a door, scaring Cecilia half to death. "Hello," he said, looking questioningly at Snape. "Who do we have here?" "My assistant," he stated. The nerve, thought Cecilia. "I stand corrected. There is another teacher here at present, Professor Binns." "Delighted," said the ghost, sounding bored, stepping through the door. He was dressed in dark Victorian-style clothes, and in his hand was a mortar board. Cecilia started to extend her hand, then withdrew it, thinking how foolish she must look trying to shake hands with someone whose body she could see the door through. She hoped neither of them had noticed. "There are other ghosts in the castle, besides Professor Binns," said Snape, as they exited the teachers' quarters and headed back down the corridor. "4 of them represent each of the houses here at Hogwarts. You needn't be alarmed if they address you," he added, glancing over to her. Cecilia said nothing, feeling slightly silly at trying to shake hands with a ghost. Just then, a whooshing sound passed them overhead. Professor Binns pulled his spectral self back through the door. "Wee-ee-ee-ee-ee-ee!" exclaimed a voice. "Merry Midsummer! Mind where you tread!" "Peeves!" shouted Snape, as they rounded the corner. He pulled up sharply to prevent them treading into the orange slime that covering the walls and floor. Cecilia had no time to react and bumped straight into him, hard. She grabbed him round the middle, before getting her balance. "Stinks up slime," he said, getting out his wand. "Scourgify," he said, swishing his wand. Almost immediately, the corridor was clean. "Dumbledore believes it is tradition for the poltergeist to remain," said Snape grimly, as they headed down the stairs. "If it were up to me, however—" He stopped speaking, and walked on determinedly, quickening his pace. Cecilia recognized the corridor, outside the room where they had appeared a few hours previously. The door they had left through had a sign, stenciled in neat copperplate writing, "Defense." What sort of defense? Wondered Cecilia. "You may use any of the items in these rooms," he said, coldly, gesturing to the doors as they passed. "The library is round the corner. It is open to teachers at any time. However, you may need the help of Madame Pince for books in the restricted section. If you value your life, that is," he added, with the hint of a sneer. Cecilia simply nodded. There would be a time to address their working relationship, but now wasn't it? She followed Snape past the door, and noticed other doors. They were similar to the defense door, thick brown beams treated with caustic solution, and all stenciled with the name of the lesson taught therein, arithmancy, transfiguration, potions. He stopped at potions and entered. Cecilia followed, entering a room which was, like the defense room, dungeon-like. It had a bookshelf stuffed full on the far wall, adjacent to a set of stairs rising to a door. The room was windowless, and the light, flickering from shrouded beacons on the wall, cast long shadows against the wall. Low cupboards lined one side and were labeled cauldrons, rivets, tripods. Above were shelves containing ingredients. Twig-like substances resided in small clear jars, each stenciled with names such as asphodel and pomegranate root. Adjacent to them was a shelf of liquids, some clear, others just this side of volatility. She approached them with interest, and watched small bubbles rise and burst in a purple solution labeled Salice Aquagia. Books sat at some of the ends and Cecilia read the titles. A Beginner's Guide to Potion Making, Applied Synthesis and Potions. A Guide, The Standard Book of Spells 1. Basic Potion Making Ingredients. Books. He said dismissively, leafing through a large, well-worn book on the desk. Of no interest to you, I am sure. Why do you say that? Asked Cecilia. Of course they were of interest to her, that was why she was here, wasn't it? And in any case, who wouldn't be interested in the contents of a potions room in a school that educated wizards and witches in magic? When he did not reply, she continued. I need to learn how magic works, if we are to make any sense of where science fits in. She walked over to him. Don't you understand that? She thought. Or perhaps you do, and are trying to put me in my place, she thought, recalling how arguing with him at Grimmauld Place hadn't worked. Do what you must, said Snape, still not looking at her. But your physical state prevents you from achieving anything magical. My physical state? She asked. You are a mole, he said, looking at her, his grey-blue eyes shimmering. Cecilia breathed, trying to maintain calm, and sat down at one of the wooden desks in front of Snape. So, how do you propose we begin? She said, a few moments later. He was still looking through the book in front of him. I'd have thought that was obvious, he said slowly, glancing up and eyeing Cecilia. She stared back at him. How was it obvious? She thought. You are going to have to teach me some magic, she said carefully, hoping it was the right thing to say. Of course not, he said, a note of triumph ringing in his voice. I will go through the theory, and you will listen. You are mistaken, however, if you think that I can teach you magic of any kind. But, she began, but he cut her off. He strode towards her and towered over where she was sitting. Listen to what I have to say, do not question it, he said, staring her down. How can I not question it? That is the point of research. Cecilia was on her feet now, their faces inches apart. You have the effrontery to question my judgment? He hissed. You know nothing about what we are facing. His stare was icy, but Cecilia was determined not to look away. If she did, she knew it would be lost. I know about research, she replied, as calmly as she could manage. We have to discuss why things happen in order to progress. There, she thought. Whatever happened next, were he to leave or turn her into a candlestick, she'd had her say. To her astonishment, however, he stepped away from her, and stood back behind the desk. If you sit, then I can begin, he said, with a tone of calm indifference, returning to the book. Cecilia exhaled, trying to steady her nerves. Bathsheba had been right, she thought. He is forbidding. Despite her usual way of clearing the air being to discuss the issue, she did what he said, and waited. 5 minutes passed. I will show you how magic is done, said Snape, eventually, inclining his head towards the wall where the exotic ingredients Cecilia had been perusing a few moments before were stored. They landed on the desk before him. These are the tools of the potion maker. To the untrained eye they are roots, stems, elixirs, tinctures. But when we make potions, the subtle art of the potion maker is brought forth. He waved his wand. A cauldron appeared on the desk before her. But began Cecilia, but a look silenced her. "There will be silence," he said, before waving his wand again. "Chamomile and cherrywood," he said, motioning towards the ingredients, before taking a flat-bladed knife out of the desk drawer. He crushed the bark with the handle and proceeded to slice the wood segments into smaller pieces. "This is too fast," she thought. "How am I ever going to get to the bottom of this if he won't explain anything?" She reached into her pocket for her notebook, and began to scribble down what he was saying. "If to wish me to treat you like a child, I will do so," he snarled, pausing in his monologue. "Still as Leviosa," he said, and Cecilia's pen began to float out of her hand, landing on the desk in front of him. "You're not explaining what you are doing," she said, raising her voice slightly. "I can see what it is you're doing, but I don't understand." Instead of replying, Snape put down the knife and wood onto the desk in front of him. "Scourge linum," he said, and the ingredients disappeared. "Let us get one thing clear," he hissed, towering over Cecilia again. "Your ignorance is your weakness. You do not have the capability to understand what constitutes magic. Do you really think I would willingly choose to associate with people as dim-witted as you? However, I do what I must, and in order for me to do that you will therefore remain silent, and listen to what I have to say." He strode back over to the desk and started to leaf through the book again. Cecilia remained at the bench, mouth open. She didn't know what to do. Were she in a lab, at home, she would undoubtedly have left. However, she was sitting in the classroom in a castle which was used to educate wizards in magic, and she didn't have the first idea what she should do. Her mind racing, she remained where she was. Eventually, Snape stopped shuffling through the book, and began again by magicking the same ingredients, cauldron and knife onto the desk. These are the tools of the potion maker. To the untrained eye they are roots, stems, elixirs, tinctures. But when we make potions, the subtle art of the potion maker is brought forth. And so it continued for the next 2 hours. Snape spoke about the cauldron, the correct thickness in order for the optimum effective potion to be made. Every time she stopped to question him, he ignored her, and continued. He showed her different preparation techniques, explained the difference between wormwood and dry toad skin, discussed the advantages and disadvantages of crowfeather over raven in treating voiceless curses. Cecilia just sat there, trying to follow what he was saying, but feeling hopeless about magic, worse than before he'd started. Eventually he stopped speaking, and closed his book. He magicked away everything that was on the desk. Cecilia wondered whether she should try to discuss what had happened. "Tomorrow, arrive here at 7. We will continue then," he said simply, before she'd made up her mind what to say, and strode out of the room, leaving Cecilia alone. She got to her feet and walked round the room, contemplating the last couple of hours. How could anyone be like that? She thought, looking round the room. What use was all that? I still don't know anything about magic, probably less now. And if I can't do it anyway, what is the point? She felt quite lost, wondering what she should do. If she'd been at home, she would have gone back to the foundations of the premise that someone was trying to explain to her and work at it herself. She would have called Alice or Nick, had a chat, and tried to iron out the problem. But what could she do here? The person she was supposed to be working with was impossible, and the premise, well, that's what they were supposed to be here for. Cecilia sighed, and went over the events of the last few days. She wondered whether she would ever feel comfortable working like this, especially with a colleague like Snape. Would it be better if she went to Dumbledore and told him she couldn't do this? At least he could find someone else to replace her. Just then, the book Snape had been using caught her eye. Its dog-eared cover betrayed its purpose, and the writing on the front cover was worn away. She crossed to the desk and opened it up randomly and read the chapter heading, Intermediate Potions for 4th Year Students, and detailed what looked to be a quite complicated recipe on the making. Cecilia turned it to the contents page and scanned it. The first chapter was entitled, Basic Potion Making for First Years, which began on page 5, so she thumbed to that page. The first half of the page contained schematic drawings of the equipment Snape had been using, neatly labeled. Underneath the chapter text began, and Cecilia read the first paragraph. These are the tools of the potion maker. To the untrained eye they are roots, stems, elixirs, tinctures. But when we make potions, the subtle art of the potion maker is brought forth. She read the paragraph again, and laughed out loud, covering her mouth slightly to hide her grin. So he was treating her like a first-year student, she thought, and wondered how so many survived to become older students with teaching like that. Cecilia picked up the book off the desk and sat down again on the bench, folding her legs under her, and continued to read. 40 pages in, and she reached the point where Snape had finished. I still don't understand it, she thought to herself, returning the book to the desk. But I don't know how he thinks I'm going to be able to without at least trying it out. But how? Cecilia thought back to what Snape had said about continuing the next day. He said 7 o'clock. So, that gives me the whole day to come back and have a look at these things, she thought, surveying the shelves of ingredients. Pleased that she'd made a decision about how she would proceed, she left the room. She felt quite hungry, and realized she hadn't had anything to eat since dinner. The Great Hall, she thought. That's where Dumbledore said meals were served. She turned right and began to proceed down the corridor. As she walked, the corridor seemed to Cecilia to narrow and the ceiling become lower. She turned a corner and saw some steps ahead of her which she didn't recognize. I've gone the wrong way, she thought, and went to turn back, and felt something brush past her leg. She looked down and saw a tatty old tabby cat interweaving between her ankles. Hello, she said to it, and bent down to tickle it behind the ears. Where did you come from? The cat began to purr, and brushed its head against her hand. Yes, that's nice, isn't it? She said to the cat, as it continued to rub against her hand. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed a figure coming towards her. She stood up and watched the figure approach. So, he said with a twisted grimace, Mrs. Norris found an intruder? He eyed Cecilia with suspicion. Cecilia was about to crouch fuss the cat again, who was head-butting her legs, when he shouted, Don't move, unless you wish me to fetch the headmaster. Cecilia opened her mouth to speak. Don't say anything. He glanced at the cat. We've caught another one, Mrs. Norris, we have. Then he stared back at Cecilia. Explain what you are doing here, and the headmaster might not have you put to death for being an intruder. She opened her mouth to speak, but paused. How was she supposed to not say anything and explain why she was there? What had she got to lose if she voiced that last thought? She did so, and waited for the fallout. Oh, think we're clever, eh, Mrs. Norris? I expect this intruder doesn't realize the caretaker of the school has the right to imprison intruders in the dungeon. Now, just hold on a minute, she said. I am here working for Professor Dumbledore, so I really don't think he'll want to put me to death this time. By all means fetch him, though, she added, as the man eyed her again. What you doing here then, if you working for the headmaster? Cecilia paused. I'm working with Professor Snape, she said. However, the work is confidential. He continued to stare at her, and Cecilia watched as a wave of realization washed over his face. You're the mole, what the headmaster told me about, he said. Then his face clouded over again. What you doing down here? You ain't allowed down here, only the classrooms and the Great Hall, he said. I got lost, said Cecilia, sighing. I arrived today, and I'm not sure which way the Great Hall is. She looked earnestly at the man and, pleading clemency, continued, "I can see you're very important, to know who I am. Do you think you could show me how to get there?" He looked at her again, frowning, then brightened again, as if he'd come to a decision. "Well, Mrs. Norris seems to have taken a liking to you, and she is very choosy, is Mrs. Norris, very choosy. So I'm going to trust her say so," he said happily to the cat, tickling her round the chin. "This way." They went past the classrooms she had passed earlier that evening and progressed out into the courtyard. Mrs. Norris followed them, trotting behind the caretaker. They entered the large front of the castle, with the wide, imposing staircase before them which she knew led to her room, and she followed him round to the back of it. Before them was a huge door which towered over them, picked with metal studs, and as they approached the doors swung open of its own accord. She walked in, awestruck. Above 5 huge wooden benches were suspended candles. No, not suspended, as there was no ceiling from which they could be. The ceiling was actually the evening sky, the light dimming to the west as the dusk began to settle in. She was so busy looking up that she banged clumsily into one of the tables. "The Great Hall," said the caretaker, staring at her again. "If you get lost again, Mel, you can find my offices on the 2nd floor." "Thank you, sir," she said, as though she had learned her lesson, "although I'll try not to get lost again." With one last look over his shoulder, probably to make sure she really wasn't an intruder, he left her alone. Cecilia cringed inwardly at the cowardly tactic she had just used, and gazed round. So, this was the Great Hall. It really was great, she thought. It was huge. She doubted whether she had seen anything so big, and so high. But then, how many ceilingless rooms had she seen before? Her stomach rumbled quietly, distracting Cecilia from her thoughts, and reminded of her why she was here. She looked around, wondering what she should do. There was no one else there at all, so she walked to the front of the hall. There was a set of 3 steps which led to a large table at the top, so she climbed them gingerly. "Hello," she called, hoping someone would appear. When no one did, she scanned the hall from the top step, surveying it. This was the Great Hall then, she thought, as the school clock chimed 10. This was where Dumbledore said to come for dinner, wasn't it? Cecilia said to herself, as she replayed the conversation in her mind. She looked round again, but still nothing, so she made her way back out of the hall, and up the large staircase. As she rounded the corner onto the 1st floor, the lion in the picture at the top growled loudly, making Cecilia jump and grab onto a handrail to steadying herself. A few moments later she regained composure and continued up the stairs to her room. Closing the door behind her, she stood with her back to it, holding the handle, and breathed a long sigh, considering everything that had happened that day. She still couldn't quite believe that she was even in a place like this, that she had gone 20-odd years of her life without knowing about people like this, to whom magic was their life. Looking round the room, she considered what to do, and she considered going to Snape's room to speak to him. Then she recalled his manner that evening and decided against it. Her eye caught the door to the bathroom, and she thought about how lovely it would be to have a soak in such a size bath. She paced across the room, throwing down her cardigan on the bed and kicking off her shoes as she passed, and entered the bathroom. The air felt much warmer there, and she took in the sink and huge bath sunk into the floor like a swimming pool. Across from her was another door to the loo. Idly she glanced at her reflection in the mirror, as she looked for the bath taps. "I've seen you looking better," her reflection said back. "And I'd lose the dress." "I intend to," replied Cecilia, unbuttoning it and letting it fall to the floor. She stepped out of it, and went to the edge of the bath, looking for a way to fill it with hot water. After 10 minutes of searching, looking inside the bath itself and on the walls, she resorted to a strip wash over the sink, thanking her lucky stars that she brought some shower gel and a flannel. An even more crestfallen Cecilia returned to her bedroom, which was cold underfoot and in the air, and tried to settle down for some sleep. She tried cuddling up with the pillow round her, and had dressed in more clothing, but her hands and feet were still freezing after an hour. I can't take much more of this, she thought. Maybe he's right. Perhaps I can't cope with this because I'm a mole. All these things aren't working because I can't do magic. No, said another voice in her head. Remember what Professor Dumbledore said. And besides, she said, getting back up, the fire could still be lit as long as she found something non-magical to burn. Cecilia got out of bed, the covers still wrapped round her, and headed for the science journals she had packed. These would do, she thought, smiling to herself at the expression on her boss's face were he to see her set fire to such a stack. She felt in her lab coat pocket and pulled out a lighter, and crossed to the large fireplace, tearing the journals up into shreds. Kneeling down by the hearth, she flicked the flint. The lighter sparked, and she smiled at the anticipation of the warmth that would come from the journals, and the satisfaction that they had been sacrificed for a good cause. Her eye was caught by a flicker of green flashing into existence at the center of the hearth, but Cecilia put it down to her imagination. Just as she got one of the corners to light, a great whooshing sound came from the chimney accompanied by a rush of air. Cecilia fell backwards in alarm and landed on her back. A ghostly face, body clad in 17th century clothing hovered over her. Do you mind, warbled the ghost, so me of you three trying to sleep. And with that, it rushed back up the chimney again. Cecilia watched it go with feelings of frustration and bewilderment. She stood back up and, still wrapped up in the covers, sank onto the bed, covering face with her hand. Why on earth had she ever thought she could handle this? What possessed her to say yes? She really must need her head looking at, she told herself sternly, wiping a stray tear from her cheek. What would Dumbledore say, though, if she went to him tomorrow to quit? He'd said this afternoon that there was barely enough time as it was. And anyway, are you really going to let someone like Professor Snape get to you? She sat back up on the bed, her legs folded under her. I'll speak to someone tomorrow, she thought. But how on earth am I going to get some rest? There was no chance she was going to be able to sleep in such a cold room, especially now she knew there was a ghost inhabiting the chimney. A sob left her, and she covered her mouth, wiping away tears which, unbidden, would not stop flowing. Eventually she composed herself and, getting to her feet, she changed into jeans and a jumper, and pulled on a pair of old trainers. Opening the door, she headed back out onto the teacher's corridor and, having no idea where she wanted to go, and frankly not caring, she turned in the direction of the huge staircase. As she descended, Cecilia noticed a door to the left of the main castle door. It was slightly ajar, and there seemed to be a glow coming from it. Beguiled by the light, she neared, and heard to her astonishment, singing. She peered round the door, and saw a set of spiral stairs descending below ground level, and before she realized what she was doing, she proceeded down. It was much warmer here, and the light she had seen at the top of the stairs opened out from a wide archway into a huge expanse. Cecilia looked in the direction of the singing and saw creatures like Dobby, who were scuttling round. They weren't exactly like Dobby, however. Their nose and ear shapes were similar, but they were dressed in old rags, and had bare feet. Some were carrying piles of washing, others large pots that they were placing on ranges at the back of the room. Cecilia watched them, transfixed as they scuttled around. It wasn't until she noticed the singing stop that she realized many eyes were upon her. "Hello," she said uncertainly, as the house elves stared at her. None of them spoke for a minute, and she wondered what to do next. "Who are you?" asked one nearest to her. The others all watched her intently, waiting for something to happen. "Cecilia," she said, hoping she sounded friendly, and was nearly bowled over by Dobby, who came springing out of the darkness. "Lady," he yelled, a huge grin on his face. On seeing Dobby greet the stranger, the other house elves recommenced their work, presumably considering that if Dobby knew this stranger then they wanted nothing to do with her, and they began to sing again. "Lady, we could not find you at dinner. We thought something terrible had happened. With ... with," he added, looking from right to left nervously. "I'm fine," she said, fighting back the urge to cry again. Dobby looked at her face. "You is the same as Dobby," he said kindly. "Wizards think of moles as they think of house elves. Worthless," he added. "You work down here?" asked Cecilia, changing the subject and sitting down on the last step of the staircase. "What is it you do?" "We's work for the headmaster," said Dobby fervently. "We serve the castle. But I is freed," he exclaimed, outstretching his arms in glee. "What sort of work?" she asked curiously, glancing round at the house elves again. "All sorts. Come, I'll show lady," said Dobby, pulling at her arm. She got up wearily, and followed him. As they toured the kitchen he showed her the washing and ironing, the repairing of furniture and rebinding of library books. They got to a small alcove where a house elf was clicking its fingers, removing the bent hobnails from a boot, and flashing a small bolt of light towards an airless one, fishing the sole back to the upper. He told Cecilia how he came to be free, that Harry Potter had tricked his master into freeing him, and how wonderful and powerful Harry Potter was. When mentioned that she was going to work with Harry, the little elf's face lit up like a Christmas tree, and he hugged her tight round the waist. After she had brushed him off, he showed her the cooking ranges. "The house elves make the meals for all of the people in the castle," said Dobby, "but we are quiet in the kitchen at the moment." Cecilia sighed, inhaling the beautiful cooking smells, and her stomach growled. "Do you think," she broached carefully as Dobby magicked a peeler and began to skin the potatoes, "that I could have something to eat?" "Why, of course, lady, anything you wish for lady who will work with Harry Potter, and Dobby will get it for you," and he clicked his fingers. A plate of cooked vegetables and rice appeared on the serving table next to her, and he clicked his fingers again and a chair appeared next to it. "Oh Dobby," she said, sitting down before the food, and proceeded to tell him about how horrible her day had been. Once she had finished she felt much better and tucked into the meal. It was heavenly, and it made her think of the wonderful food Tim used to cook for them, when they were married. When she had finished, Dobby tugged at her arm. "Come lady," he said, dragging her towards the door. Cecilia followed him all the way back to her room. He clicked his fingers, and to her astonishment the fire was lit, glowing a toasty orange, and irradiating the room with its glorious heat. "Lady," said Dobby, gesturing towards the bathroom, and as she watched, Dobby clicked his fingers and the bath slowly filled with water from the bottom up. The froth from her bubble bath overflowed onto the floor slightly. "I hopes this will make lady feel happier," said Dobby, watching her bemused face. "Thank you Dobby, I am much happier now," she said, smiling at him. He clicked his fingers again and disapparated. Pulling off her clothes for the second time, she sat on the side of the bath. The water felt beautiful against her skin, and as she slowly slipped in, it seemed to Cecilia that it was washing away her worries too. When she awoke next morning, she was startled to see Dobby sitting on the desk. She blinked a few times, and slowly the memories of the previous day flooded back into her conscious mind. "Hello Dobby, how long have you been waiting there?" she asked sleepily. "Dobby is waiting here since the mail arrived," he said, and held out an envelope. She took it, thanking him, and he sat watching her intently. "Mrs. Cecilia Frobisher," she read, looking at the beautiful scripting. "8th room on the right, the teacher's corridor, 1st floor, Hogwarts Castle, Northumberland, England." She turned it over. She put her finger under the edge of it, and noticed it was sealed with a blob of wax. It was from Tonks. She had been to check on Amy, and everything was fine. There was also an invitation asking Cecilia to join Tunks, the Weasley family and the children in 3 weeks' time to go shopping. Shopping, thought Cecilia, that sounded good, and wondered how she was supposed to reply to Tunks when she hadn't provided an address. She was about to mention this to Dobby, but as she put the letter down, he spoke. "Dobby thinks that Lady would like breakfast now," said Dobby earnestly, "if Lady would like to come to the Great Hall." "That sounds lovely, Dobby," she said, smiling at him. He disapparated. After breakfast, where she was waited on by a host of house elves, she returned to her room and collected the glassware and books she wanted in order to start analyzing the ingredients in the potions classroom. Gone were her feelings of unease and upset, and she packed what she needed and headed out over the courtyard and into the teaching area of the castle. 88,888,888. Cecilia spent the next week working thus. In the mornings she went to the potions room and proceeded to systematically test the ingredients labeled on the shelves. She recorded everything: physical properties, size, shape and, when she found a rather obnoxious green substance lurking in a metallized container, storage conditions. By around 6 o'clock, she would return her equipment to her room and meet Snape back in the classroom, where she would spend 2 hours in silence listening to him describe the potion's ingredients, their properties and applications. Such descriptions were interspersed with barbed derision of her, and it was these that spurred her on. By the time Snape had departed at around 9 p.m., her mind was buzzing with the next experiment she would carry out the following day. She would then return to the Great Hall, where Dobby would be buzzing about her. Some evenings Cecilia spent in the kitchen with the house elves. Gradually some of them spoke to her, though 1 or 2 did not. She discovered that the elves had to do many of the tasks by hand as a symbol of the house elves' status below wizards. They were astonished one evening when Cecilia began to help with their tasks, some even displaying hostility until Dobby proclaimed her equal to them, as a mole, under wizards. When she did not visit the kitchen, Cecilia would proceed to the library to cross-reference observations she had made or check information. The information she had gathered either by experiment or theory she used to create diagrams of interlinking factors between magic and science. She learned about a sport that was played on broomsticks by the students, and that there were 4 different houses in the school. She had even managed to send a reply to Tunks, and spent an interesting morning sending said letter by owl, Dobby ever willing to help her if she asked, especially if it meant he could talk about his favorite subject, Harry Potter. It had not escaped her notice, however, that she would have to tell Snape about what she had been doing, one way or another. She wondered how she would tell him, and what his reaction would be, but the events one morning 10 days after her arrival at Hogwarts took it out of her hands. Carrying some glassware down the teacher's corridor, Cecilia remembered she had not picked up her notebook. She left the box of flasks at the top of the stairs, went to get it, but it wasn't where she left it, on her desk. She returned to the box of glassware at the top of the stairs, thinking she may have slipped it down the side, but no, so she proceeded with it to the potions classroom. The door was ajar, so she pushed it open with her bum, while still holding the box, and came face to face with Snape. In fright, she dropped the box, and a few £100 of Grade A smashed to smithereens in front of her. He glared at her with anger, and strode over to her. "So," he said, his face inches from her. "This is what you are doing when you are not at my class," he growled. Cecilia shivered in shock. "How dare you?" he hissed, but Cecilia moved out of the way. "How else could I have proceeded?" she shouted, defensively. "I tried to tell you weeks ago I couldn't understand what you were saying. But I worked on it myself, and I know I'm making progress." "Why you?" he began, making towards her and backing her towards a wall. "Me what?" she said, determined to give as good as she got. "You should be happy that I took the trouble. otherwise we would be months at this, and besides, I'm going to have to start teaching you science." He stopped and turned. "You learn all this," he gestured to her lab book, "yourself?" "It's not entirely learning, is it?" said Cecilia, relieved she actually survived, for now. "I just used my knowledge of unknowns and tested your ingredients." "And read about them," she added. "And you have the audacity to stand there in front of me and say that?" he shouted angrily, striding over to Cecilia. She tried to move, but was frozen to the spot. "That's it. I'm done for," she thought. "Severus," said a voice, softly behind them. Snape stopped his murderous advance and turned. "Professor Dumbledore," he said, altogether more calmly, turning away from Cecilia. "Mrs. Frobisher, I would be grateful if you would return to your room and fetch more equipment for your science," said Dumbledore calmly. She nodded and quickly left, crunching the broken glass underfoot. She could not find everything she needed, but when she returned, Snape was standing next to Dumbledore, looking far less enraged than he had done before. Cecilia placed the glassware on the bench in front of them and looked between them, waiting for one of them to say something. Finally Dumbledore spoke. "Professor Snape and I have agreed that you will be teaching him some Muggle science from today. I am impressed with what you have done so far, and we both feel it is time to take it one step further, to build on the work you have begun. I'd like you start now, if you would." He smiled at Cecilia. "Now," she thought. "Here? But I'm not ready, I can't, and I don't really want to be left with Snape on my own." As if reading her mind, Dumbledore added, "I am also intrigued by the science of Muggles, Cecilia, so, with your permission, I should like to stay for the lesson." Before her mind could disobey, Cecilia dug in the box for some beakers. She pulled down some ingredients from the shelves which she knew would be suitable for demonstrations. She began with the Greek philosophers and discussed their understanding and interpretation of the world. Galileo was her next source of inspiration, and she talked about how important his observations of the celestial bodies were. When she discussed Newton, she talked about his laws of motion, how an object remains at rest until a force is applied to it. She tried to demonstrate this with some glass balls, and commented that the demonstration didn't work particularly well because they weren't totally spherical, and nearly jumped out of her skin when Dumbledore pulled out his wand and blue light shot out of the end, rectifying her problem. Cecilia tried to link what she was saying to the wizard's frame of reference by asking questions to find out their prior knowledge and framed examples around what she already knew about in Hogwarts, and they asked her questions. Periodically she would ask whether that was enough, and each time both Snape and Dumbledore encouraged her to proceed. Eventually Dumbledore brought the lesson to a close. "That was a most enlightening, Cecilia," he said, smiling. "I must admit, I was worried about your progress together as a team," he said, looking between Cecilia and Snape, "but Professor Snape has assured me that you will continue together in your mutual disciplines." Cecilia looked across to Professor Snape, who nodded slightly. "But if you would excuse me," said Dumbledore, rising from the bench in front of her, "there are regrettably other matters that demand my attention." With that he left, and Cecilia and Snape were left alone. "Cecilia, I must apologize for my outburst earlier." He stood too, and began to help her reshell the ingredients she had used. "Yes," she said eventually, allowing herself a moment of shallow self-indulgence. He said nothing, allowing her to continue. "I think we should carry on with how we were," she said, handing him the last jar. "I have to admit, you understand far more about science than I do about magic." "I have duties with the Order," he interjected. "Great," thought Cecilia, "just where I wanted to lead you. I feel you need to know more theory about magic, especially about the wizarding world. So if I continue to work on that when you are not here," she said, leading the conversation passively. We can then work on interconnecting science and magic," he concluded. "If you agree to my suggestion, Cecilia, our work may be more efficient." "Oh, excellent," Cecilia said to herself. "Men. Doesn't matter whether they're old, young, magical. They're so easy to manipulate if you know how." 88,888,888. Cecilia hadn't banked on how difficult the next fortnight would be. The hard work came in the form of getting over the understanding of science to Snape when his frame of reference was limited. It was like trying to explain to someone what color the sky was when they could only see in monochrome. Similarly, when Snape spoke about magical theory, because Cecilia couldn't actually perform the magic herself, it made it very difficult for her to relate to it, and it ended up frustrating him so much he would either throw something, or walk out of the classroom. She had also made the mistake of asking him to construct a concept map of what he understood about science, with the intention of herself doing the same for magic. This had resulted in him setting fire to the parchment and storming out of the classroom, leaving Cecilia wondering if he would actually return. In the end, she spent a considerable amount of time compiling what was, for want of a better word, a dictionary where the same reaction, condition or phenomenon was cross-referenced, and put up the diagrams they had made on the dungeon walls. Her days progressed as they had done before, and she often bypassed the Great Hall and turned up when she felt like it in the house elves' kitchens, usually being overwhelmed by Dobby's inexorable enthusiasm. Snape had told Cecilia she was welcome to use the books in the potions classroom, the ones that were stacked high, and with the help of Dobby, she had reshelved some of them lower down within her reach. When he arrived to work in the evenings, she would ask him about things she had just found out, and he would talk about what he thought they should focus on that night. And when they disagreed, an amicable agreement was reached most of the time. From a distance, she thought, it was not entirely indistinguishable from a normal working relationship, and though their disagreements were often unresolved, they each discussed them fairly. Cecilia did not back down through fear, and he did not insult her. They were at last on common ground. However, he was frequently cold, critical and obdurate, with their conversations remaining strictly within the confines of science and magic. If ever Cecilia mentioned personal details or asked him about matters concerning himself, Snape would silently ignore her and backtrack to the last part of the conversation that pertained to work. One evening, however, Cecilia was shocked to see him arrive disheveled. His hair was hiding most of the right side of his face, and he was stooping from the shoulder. "What the Severus?" she began, jumping down from the desk where she had been sitting cross-legged a few moments before. "Leave it," he growled, brushing past her. "You're hurt," she said again, trying to follow him. "Please, let me help," she asked, but he proceeded into the room at the back of the classroom, returning 10 minutes later. "Shall we begin?" he asked, as if nothing had happened. But Cecilia didn't want to let it go. "I don't want to know what work you do when you are not here," she said, "but strange as this may sound, I actually do care about you." She stopped, considering the last bit of the sentence. "Your welfare," she clarified. "Your sentiments are noble," said Snape, a cutting edge to his voice, but softened. "Work for the Order. It's sometimes a bit risky. I'm okay now." Cecilia nodded, and they proceeded to consider the relationship between Feriverto and conservation of energy. Later, soaking in a hot bath, she pondering the way he affirmed his working for the Order, and Cecilia wondered if he knew he'd earned some of her respect. 88,888,888. Cecilia received another letter from Tunks 2 days before the shopping trip. She'd been meaning to mention it to Snape about having the weekend off, and somehow getting to Grimmauld Place. She'd barely thought about the Weasley family, Remus and the others, and she wondered whether she actually wanted to go back to Grimmauld Place when she felt quite settled here. Since he admitted his injuries to Cecilia almost a week ago, their relationship had lost its hard edge. She was able to mention, for example, if she was feeling tired. He even admitted he'd lost the point of what she was saying and asked her to repeat it, something he wouldn't have done before. "I'll ask him tonight whether he could take me back to Grimmauld Place, or how I could get there if he can't." Happy she'd made a decision, she tore some paper out of the back of her lab book, writing that she would be there, and risked her hands being pecked to shreds by one of the school owls. The day passed relatively quietly. The mid-August sun had made her take her books outside and she lay out on her stomach reading through mysterious mythology again, distracted every so often by Remus's face appearing in her mind. "Blow this for a lark," she thought, hearing the school clock chime 6, and went inside wondering why she had been thinking about someone she had met once 3 weeks ago. When Snape arrived that evening, she was reading a parchment she had found lodged between 2 books near the top of the bookshelf half an hour before. "Severus, I was wondering," she said, without looking up, "what is the mark of the Dark Lord?" She waited for him to answer, and when he didn't, she looked at the parchment, in case she had misread it. "What?" he said quietly, turning his head to look at her. His eyes were stony grey, and light flashed behind them. "It says here," said Cecilia, reading from the parchment, "that the Dark Lord, in his unmerciful power, brings forth only the most loyal to receive the mark, and the mark of the Dark Lord is bound to the soul of the servant until his dying day." She looked back up at him questioningly, just in time to dodge bits of broken glass that were flying in her direction. She gasped as Snape strode towards her. "Give that to me," he stormed, grabbing her by the wrist, pushing her up against the dungeon wall. He put his other hand over her mouth, pressing his full weight against her. "Didn't you hear when I said you could only touch those books?" He tilted his head towards the shelves, squeezing her wrist tight against the stone until she unclenched her fingers. "Or are you too stupid to understand?" Cecilia tried to inhale. She felt lightheaded and dizzy. He snatched it from her hand and she slumped down the wall, gasping at the clammy air. She held her chest, staring at the flagstones. "Cecilia," he said, standing over her. "Touch.me." She panted, her head angled to the floor and her eyes closed. She extended her arm, palm outstretched. She sat there for about 10 minutes, waiting for her breathing to return to normal, and she looked round the room. Snape was not in the dungeon. She gave herself another few minutes and got to her feet. Her wrist was throbbing, and her lungs felt as if she was a heavy smoker. She slumped back on one of the benches. What on earth had just happened? All she had done was what she had done every night for almost a fortnight. The parchment was on a shelf, between 2 books, nowhere else. That was irrelevant now though. She couldn't believe his reaction and wondered about the significance of what she'd said. She should have felt angry, or at least more scared, and was surprised to find that she wasn't. Why? He was angry with her, with Cecilia. But she wasn't the reason. Cecilia rose unsteadily, and began looking for Snape. She didn't know where to look, or whether he'd still be in the castle, but she eventually found him in the library. "Severus," she said quietly. She knew he hadn't meant it and wanted him to know that. He said nothing, and tried to walk out without looking at her. She stood in his way. "Stand aside," he said stonily, staring at her. "Severus," she said, looking back at him, her eyes full of concern. "I'm sorry." He stepped towards her, not breaking eye contact. "What do you have to be sorry for?" He looked down at her swollen wrist. He tried to push past her again. She started to get annoyed. "An explanation," she said. "Please, Severus, you owe me that much." He stopped and, glancing down at her wrist again, whispered something. Suddenly the pain stopped and the burning waned. "I overreacted," he said. "And for that I apologize." "Okay," said Cecilia evenly, knowing she would have to play her diplomatic skills to the limit. "But my apology still stands. I should have asked before I looked at the parchment. I just assumed it was part of the book, you see. She could see he was in no fit state to tell her why his reaction was so volatile. He looked at her wordlessly, and it appeared to Cecilia that he was trying to tell her, just with that mournful gaze, if he could undo the last hour of their lives he most certainly would have. That was enough of an apology for her, though she still felt a bit shaken. Vulnerable, that's what he seemed like. She had a strong desire to tell him that it was all right. "Tunks sent me a letter, I got it this morning," said Cecilia, smiling faintly. "I wish you'd told me this is how you had post-delivered. I nearly had the shock of my life when an owl dropped this on me outside." She smiled again, to try and lighten the mood, and sat down on one of the chairs. Snape sat next but one to her, his head still inclined downwards. "She says they are going shopping this weekend too." She squinted at the letter, trying to read the destination, diagonally. She looked again, and back at Snape. "Diagonally? Is that a direction? Anyway, we are going diagonally, apparently, to get some shopping with Mr. and Mrs. Weasley and their children, and some other children by the sound of it, and she wonders whether I would like to come." She looked up to face him, and swung the leg nearest to Snape under her, so she was facing him. "I wasn't going to, but I think we need a break from one another, work-wise. Besides, it'll be nice to see the others. It seems ages since I met you all. "Spare me the details," said Snape coldly. "I know you are only trying to leave in the nicest way you can. I don't want to hear it. There's the door," he snapped, jabbing his finger towards the library door. He stood up and walked over to the fireplace, arms folded with his back to her. Cecilia looked at the door, then back at him, confused. She didn't want to leave. Surely he understood they'd need a break once in a while? No, she thought. He still thinks I'm angry with him,